Thorne in My Side by Anthony Darder, Chapter 1. The weight that hit my chest didn't feel like 9 pounds of muscle and fur. It felt like a solid sack of dry cement dropped from a low-flying biplane. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't have to. The sharp, rhythmic vibration digging into my sternum told me everything I needed to know. The sun wasn't even fully over the hills yet. But the morning shift had officially begun. "Good morning, boy," I muttered, my voice sounding like it had been dragged through a gravel pit. I reached up a heavy arm, blinking against the pale gray light cutting through the bedroom blinds. "I guess you're telling me it's time to get my ass out of bed." Hammett gave a short, high-pitched meow, the one that meant he was entirely done waiting, and leaned forward. Aggressively grinding his wet nose and whiskers were right against my stubbled chin. He was a black shadow with green eyes and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for a late breakfast. I rolled him off my chest, earning me a brief, indignant hiss before he repositioned himself at the foot of the mattress, tail twitching like a metronome. The left side of the bed was already cold. Rose had slipped out hours ago to catch the early shift at the diner, leaving behind the faint, comforting scent of her lavender soap and a perfectly made pillow. I lay there for a 30-second count, staring at the ceiling plaster, letting the reality of the day settle into my bones. The Antwerp Cross was sitting in a secure vault somewhere in Illinois by now, and the money from Pandolini was locked tight in the agency safe. By all accounts, we were flush. We were safe. But as I pulled myself upright and swung my feet onto the cold hardwood floor, a different kind of dread started knocking at the back of my skull. Joe was coming into the office today. He'd been discharged from St. Vincent's 3 days ago, with a thigh full of stitches, a bottle of pills he refused to take, and strict medical orders to keep his weight off the leg. That meant desk duty. A caged, crippled Joe Russo behind a typewriter was a hazard to anyone within city limits. You can't avoid the storm forever, I figured. Might as well go get drenched. I spent 20 minutes under the hot water of the shower, washed the sleep out of my eyes, and scraped a straight razor across my jaw until I looked like a licensed investigator again. I threw on a fresh white shirt, knotted a gray silk tie, and slid my arms into the sleeves of the charcoal suit. "Come on, detective," I told the cat, who was already waiting by the front door, looking like a tiny, sleek panther. "Let's go face the music." The boulevard was quiet for a Tuesday morning, the smog still hanging low and damp over the street lamps. I parked the coupe in the alley lot, took the stairs 2 at a time, and unlocked the frosted glass door of the Morgan Russo Detective Agency. The second the latch clicked, I picked Hammett up under his front legs and set him gently onto the polished linoleum floor. "Attention!" I shouted into the quiet office, my voice echoing off the glass transoms. Sarge was already at her desk, her dark hair pinned back in a neat, flawless roll, her fingers poised over the keys of her Underwood. She didn't miss a beat. She snapped her spine straight, locked her chin in place, and brought a crisp, military salute right to her brow, her blue eyes dancing with a sharp morning grin. "Good morning, General," Sarge said, dropping the salute back to the home row keys. "The troops are currently mobilizing, some more reluctantly than others." Hammett, completely ignoring her, strutted across the floor with his tail held high, the absolute commander of the infantry. He marched straight past her desk, his paws clicking softly on the fresh wax, and stopped right in front of his ceramic dish near the radiator. He didn't sit. He just turned around, fixed his green eyes on me, and stared with an icy, unblinking intensity that could have broken a hardened safecracker. Yeah, hold your horses," I muttered, walking over and grabbing the box of dried kibble from the bottom shelf. I knelt down, emptied the stale water into the basin, replaced it with a fresh, cold stream from the cooler, and dumped a heavy handful of food into his dish. Hammett didn't offer a thank you. He just buried his nose in the bowl and started crunching, his tail settling into a satisfied purr. I straightened up, popping my knuckles, and looked over at Sarge's desk blotter. Right next to her typewriter sat a fresh, steaming mug of black Maxwell House and a small, folded pink note in Rose's distinct, neat handwriting. "Your wife stopped by on her break," Sarge said, nodding toward the note. "Brought the coffee. She said to tell you she loves you and that if you let Joe lift anything heavier than a pencil today, she's going to personally come up here and use your head for target practice." I picked up the mug, taking a long, grateful swallow of the hot coffee. "She's a very protective woman, Sarge." "She's a smart woman, Jack," Sarge corrected dryly, rolling a fresh sheet of carbon paper into the roller with a loud, aggressive zip. Because speaking of the invalid, before she could finish the sentence, a heavy, uneven thudding sound echoed from the outer hallway. It was followed immediately by the harsh, metal scrape of a crutch catching on the top step, and a string of muffled, highly creative curses that could have peeled the paint right off the doorframe. The storm had arrived. The frosted glass rattled as the door was kicked open with entirely too much force. Slowly, painfully, Joe managed to make his way into the office. He looked like an angry bear that had been caught in a bear trap and was thoroughly insulted by the whole experience. His face was twisted into a scowl. His knuckles were white around the grips of a pair of wooden crutches, and his left leg was swung outward in a stiff, awkward arc to keep his stitched-up thigh from bending. I leaned against the doorframe of my inner office, crossed my arms, and let a slow, smart-ass smirk spread across my face. I gave a grand, sweeping gesture with my coffee mug toward the door of his office. "Your chariot awaits, sir." Joe stopped dead in the center of the room, balancing precariously on his right foot. He glared at me with enough heat to ignite the drapes. "I'll serve you right across the head with this crutch, Morgan." "I'm glad to see you're in a chipper mood this morning," I replied, taking a slow sip. "Those damn doctors," Joe grumbled, hoisting himself forward another agonizing 2 feet. "What do they know? I feel fine. I'm ready to go back to work. A little scratch in the rail yard, and they treat me like I'm made of glass." "Until you rip a stitch," Sarge chimed in smoothly, her fingers never missing a beat on the keys, her eyes fixed firmly on the affidavit she was copying. Joe swung his head toward her, his jaw tight. "Oh, a comedy act. The Morgan and James variety hour." "I'll juggle for you if you get off that damn leg," I said, having to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled just to keep from laughing out loud. "Keep it up, Jack. Just keep it up," Joe muttered, shooting me a lethal look as he navigated the final stretch to his office door. He shuffled past his file cabinets, hoisted his bad leg over the trash can, and dropped heavily into his leather swivel chair with a long, guttural groan that sounded like a boiler losing pressure. He leaned the crutches against the wall, where they immediately slid and clattered loudly against the floorboards. Joe cursed again, ignored them, and yelled out toward the front room. "Sarge, pour me a cup of coffee, will you? Black, no sugar." Sarge finally stopped typing. She sighed, but there was a softness in her eyes that contradicted the eye roll she gave me. She got up from her desk, poured a steaming mug from the pot, and picked up the morning edition of the Los Angeles Times from the mail pile. She walked into Joe's office, setting the coffee down on his blotter right next to his inkwell, and dropped the newspaper squarely in front of him. "I suggest you read the comics section," Sarge said, her own lips twitching as she fought down a laugh. "Maybe it will put you in a better mood, detective." Yeah, Joe grunted, grabbing the mug. "Maybe I'll find a strip about a secretary who minds her own damn business." Sarge just patted his shoulder, turned on her heel, and walked back out to her desk. I caught her eye as she passed me, and she had to look away to keep from breaking. It wasn't funny that Joe had taken a bullet. The memory of the blood on the rail yard gravel still gave me a cold chill if I thought about it too long. But the sheer spectacular scale of his current ranting was absolute comedy gold. The man was a force of nature when he was miserable. Joe rattled the newspaper, snapping the pages open with enough aggression to tear the edges. "Look at this garbage. Standard oil layout. A clearance sale at Bullock's. Not a damn thing worth reading." Right on cue, Hammett strolled into Joe's office. The black cat hopped effortlessly onto the corner of the mahogany desk, walked right across the open pages of the Times, and sat down directly on top of the political cartoons. staring at Joe with cool indifference. Joe stared at the cat. The cat stared at Joe. Great, Joe muttered, leaning back. Now the livestock is staging a sit-in. Jack, get your panther off my paperwork. Before I could answer, the sharp, shrill ring of the telephone shattered the morning quiet, cutting right through the banter. Out in the front room, the ring stopped instantly as Sarge picked up the receiver. Morgan and Russo Agency. Hold for just one moment, please. There was a brief pause, and then Sarge's voice dropped its usual professional lilt. It went completely flat, the tone she used when things were about to get complicated. Jack, she called out, her eyes meeting mine through the open door. It's a collect call from the Los Angeles County Jail, Chapter 2. I walked out to the front room, my loafers squeaking slightly on Sarge's immaculate floor, and took the heavy black receiver right from her hand. Morgan, I barked into the mouthpiece. For a second, there was nothing but the harsh, mechanical hiss of a long-distance line routed through a central switchboard. Then, a familiar voice cut through the static, low, gravelly, and carrying a distinct Midwestern drawl I hadn't heard since we were burning government gasoline in the European theater. It's Thorne. I need your help, the man on the line said. Thorne? I frowned, the name rattling around in my skull before the tumbler finally clicked. David Thorne? Yes, it's Dave, he said, his voice dropping an octave, as if he was trying to keep the jailhouse guards from listening in. I'm in jail. I was hoping you could help me out. I leaned one hip against the corner of Sarge's desk, letting out a short chuckle. Are you still getting into drunken brawls, Thorne? I wish it were that simple, Thorne said, and the absolute lack of humor in his tone instantly killed my smile. They picked me up this morning for murder. My grip tightened on the receiver. Who did you kill? Nobody, David snapped back, a sharp edge of panic bleeding through his professional veneer. The girl I was with at the bar last night, they found her dead. I glanced over at Sarge. Her eyes were locked onto mine, her pencil hovering over her shorthand pad waiting. Okay, Dave, just stay put, I said, my investigator brain already shifting into gear. I'll be down there as soon as I can. As if I have a choice, Thorne muttered dryly, followed by the sharp, metallic clack of the jailhouse phone being slammed back onto its cradle. I lowered the receiver, resting it back on the fork. Before I could even turn around, Joe's voice came booming out of his inner office, loud enough to rattle the glass transoms. Who is it, Jack? He yelled. David Thorne, I called back, walking toward his doorway. Joe stopped wrestling with his newspaper, his eyebrows shooting straight up toward his hairline. What the hell is David Thorne doing in town? Last I knew, he was working out of a detective agency in Kansas City. He didn't say, I said, leaning against his doorframe. Just that he was picked up for murder this morning. Murder? Dave? Joe's scowl deepened, his stubborn jaw tightening as his mind raced back to the trenches. That's a load of garbage. Thorne's a lot of things, but he ain't a killer. Yeah, I'm gonna run down to the county jail and try to get to the bottom of this, I said, reaching back into my pocket to make sure my keys and my wallet were in place. Joe immediately gripped the arms of his leather swivel chair, his face straining as he braced his good foot against the floorboards, trying to hoist his heavy frame upward. Do you want me to ride along? In case something goes wrong? He tried to sound casual, completely sincere, but the desperate look in his eyes gave him away. He'd do anything to get out from behind that desk. No, I said, putting a hand up to stop him before he could even stand. I shot a wicked, deliberate smirk over my shoulder toward the front desk. I need you to stay here and keep Sarge company. She gets so lonely in this big office all alone. Behind me, the rapid-fire clack, clack, clack of the underwood stopped instantly. Sarge slowly looked up from her paperwork, her blue eyes narrowing into two icy slits as she glared a hole straight through the back of my suit jacket. If looks could chamber around, I'd have been wearing a piece of lead between my shoulder blades. Keep it up, Morgan, Joe grumbled, sinking back into his chair with a defeated sigh. Just keep it up. But if you don't bring me back a decent sandwich from the deli down by the courthouse, I'm going to shoot you myself. No promises, Russo, I grinned, grabbing my fedora off the coat rack. Watch the cat. 10 minutes later, the DeSoto was tearing down Sunset Boulevard, heading straight for the grim, gray concrete facade of the LA County Jail. The morning sun was finally breaking through the heavy fog, but the air inside my car felt cold. David Thorne was a smart guy, a damn good investigator, and a brother in arms. If the LA homicide squad had him in a cell, it meant they either had an airtight box with his name on it, or someone was pulling the strings on a very ugly, very professional frame-up. And in this town, the frames usually came wrapped in a shroud. The LA County Jail always smelled the same, a miserable cocktail of cheap industrial disinfectant, stale tobacco, and the cold sweat of desperate men. I flashed my badge at the front desk, slipped the desk sergeant a crisp $5 bill from the Pandolini stash to speed up the paperwork, and followed a burly, keys-clanking guard down the dim concrete corridor toward the attorney-client visitation rooms. The room they shoved me into was small, windowless, and illuminated by a single buzzing bulb hanging from a frayed cord. In the center sat a scarred oak table and 2 heavy metal chairs. A moment later, the heavy iron door on the opposite side groaned open, and a guard escorted David Thorne into the room. He didn't look like the sharp-dressed, fast-talking Missouri Dick I remembered. His tie was gone, his shoelaces had been confiscated, and his white shirt was rumpled and stained with tobacco ash. But beneath the exhaustion and the dark shadows under his eyes, that same hard, calculating, army gaze remained intact. He took one look at me, ran a heavy hand through his messy hair, and let out a tired, ragged breath. "You took your sweet time, Morgan," Thorne said, pulling out the metal chair and dropping into it. "I was starting to think you forgot the way down here." "The traffic on the boulevard is a killer, Dave," I said, pulling out my own chair and sitting across from him. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a fresh pack of Camels, flipped 2 out, and slid the pack across the scarred wood. "Talk to me. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out a damn thing. Who was the girl?" Thorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the scarred table, a ghost of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth despite the gray jailhouse walls. "The girl's name was Judy Goldfinch," David said, shaking his head. "I met her at the bar last night. Look, Jack, I didn't come to town on a case. I came into town to surprise you and Joe because I found out you 2 knuckleheads had your own agency. I had to see it for myself. You 2 walking disciplinary problems running a business? It sounded like a gag." I couldn't help but crack a faint smile at that. In the infantry, Thorne had been the one keeping us from getting court-martialed every time Joe lost his temper or I pushed a lieutenant too far. "I walked her home from the bar," David continued, his face darkening again as the reality of the morning snapped back into focus. "We were both pretty bombed. I walked her right to her door like a gentleman and walked a few blocks to the hotel I'm staying in. That was it. Next thing I know, I was woke up by loud banging at the door and was met by 2 uniforms who hauled my ass in here." I took a final drag of my Camel, crushing the butt out in a rusted tin tray on the table. "Okay, Dave, just sit tight. I'll go talk to the guy up front and see if I can get you out of here." I left the visitation room, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind me, and walked back out to the front desk. The desk captain was flipping through a stack of arrest sheets, looking thoroughly bored by the Tuesday morning routine. "What's the word on Thorne, Captain?" I asked, leaning against the wooden counter. The man sighed, sliding a folder to the side. "We have no actual evidence that links Mr. Thorne yet, Jack. I can waive the bail and release him to your custody, as long as he does not leave town until he is cleared by homicide. He isn't going anywhere, I promised, signing my name across the bottom of the release voucher. He's staying right under my nose." I walked back down the corridor and pushed the door open to the interrogation room. Thorne looked up, the unlit Camel still dangling from his bottom lip. "Thorne, you're coming with me," I said, tossing his confiscated shoelaces onto the table in front of him. "But until you are cleared by the boys in homicide, your LA vacation has been extended." Thorne didn't waste any time. He snatched up his laces, threaded them through his boots with the quick, efficient precision of a soldier, and stood up, adjusting his rumpled shirt. "I appreciate it, Jack," he muttered as we walked out past the booking desk and into the bright, blinding glare of the mid-morning sun. "Now, where's this fancy office of yours? And more importantly, where's Russo keeping his liquor?" "We're heading there now," I said, unlocking the passenger door of the DeSoto. "But you're going to have to tread lightly. Joe's on desk duty, he's got a thigh full of stitches, and he's currently being guarded by a very protective secretary. The mood in that office is explosive." The DeSoto hummed as we tore back up the boulevard, the heavy frame smoothing out the bumps in the asphalt. Thorne sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing palm trees and neon signs, looking like a man who couldn't quite believe he wasn't behind bars anymore. When I opened the door of the office and ushered Thorne inside, the office routine came to a grinding halt. Joe was leaning so far out of his office doorway, he was practically falling off his crutches, his face lighting up the second he saw the silhouette in the transom. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Joe boomed, a genuine, rare grin breaking through his usual scowl. "David Thorne, you magnificent bastard." From behind her typewriter, Sarge stopped her fingers mid-stroke. Her blue eyes sized Thorne up in a fraction of a second, taking in the rumpled shirt, the tobacco ash, and the distinct look of a guy who had just spent the morning on a city mattress. "Welcome to the asylum, Mr. Thorne," Sarge said dryly, though her expression softened into a welcoming nod. "I'm Sarge. Try not to track any jailhouse dust under the floorboards. I've already had enough to deal with today trying to keep Russo in line." Chapter 3. The brass latch clicked, and the frosted glass door swung inward. Paulie walked in, his hands shoved deep into his overcoat pockets, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. He didn't say hello. He didn't even look at anyone. He just marched straight over to the leather couch in the corner and flopped down onto the cushions with a heavy, exhausted sigh, tipping his fedora down until it completely covered his eyes. Thorne stood by the filing cabinet, watching the whole display. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "That's what I figured," David said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "If you two are here, the third stooge was bound to show up." Paulie didn't move a muscle, but his voice came out flat and dry from beneath the brim of his hat. "Go to hell, Dave." "Nice to see you too, pal," David chuckled, completely unfazed. He stepped closer to the couch, looking down at the human outline buried in the leather. "Hey, whatever happened to that girl you were always talking about? Back in the barracks, you wouldn't shut up about her. I was starting to be afraid you were going to make us all fuck her when we got home. She was so great." Paulie shifted slightly, just enough to clear his jaw. "I married her." David blinked, genuinely caught off guard, a sudden grin breaking through his exhaustion. "Speaking of," I interrupted, a smile tugging at my jaw, "I have someone I need to introduce you to. She's down at the diner right now." From the depths of his inner office, Joe's ears must have picked up the word diner. The leather of his swivel chair groaned as he swung himself toward the doorway. "You are bringing me," Joe yelled, his scowl returning with full force. "I didn't get that deli sandwich I asked for, Jack. I'm starving." All right, I said, raising my hands. I looked over at the couch, then back at David. "Those crutches can stay here. David, Paulie, grab an arm. I'll grab the doors. Let's get this poor man some food before he completely wastes away into nothing." Paulie rolled off the couch, finally pushing his hat back while Thorne stepped into the office. The two of them flanked Joe's chair. Joe hoisted himself up on his one good leg, grunting as he threw his massive arms over their shoulders. David and Paulie braced their weight and began hauling the injured soldier toward the front exit like a pair of infantrymen moving a piece of heavy artillery. As they hoisted him past the front desk, I paused and looked over at the typewriter. "Sarge, while we are out, please see what you can find out about a girl named Judy Goldfinch," I said, my voice dropping its casual tone, Start with the local precincts, then check the phone logs if you can bounce a favor off the operator. Sarge didn't even look up from her Underwood, her fingers already hovering over the home row keys, ready to strike. I'm on it, Sarge replied. The diner down the block smelled of burnt onions, strong chicory coffee, and fried grease. The late morning rush had cleared out, leaving the vinyl booths mostly quiet. Behind the counter, standing near the stainless steel coffee urns and a crisp, neat apron, was Rose. Her red hair caught the sunlight coming through the front glass, and the moment she saw our chaotic procession stumble through the door, with David and Polly practically carrying a scowling Joe, a warm, familiar smile lit up her face. Well, look what the tide washed in, Rose said, wiping her hands on a towel and walking out from behind the counter. Rose, this is David Thorne, I said, gesturing to the rumpled Kansas City Dick, who was currently trying not to drop my partner. Dave, this is my wife, Rose. Thorne stopped dead in his tracks, nearly causing Joe to lose his balance. He looked at Rose, then looked at me, his eyes widening in pure disbelief. You? David pointed a finger at me, a massive laugh bubbling up from his chest. You got a girl like this to actually say I do? Jack, you must have pulled the biggest con in the history of the state of California. Keep moving, Thorne, Joe grumbled, his face twisting as he hopped along. The lady can insult him after I get a menu in my hands. My stomach is touching my backbone. Rose chuckled, totally unfazed by the banter. Sit down in the big booth, boys. I'll bring over a platter of pastrami and some hot coffee before Joe decides to eat the linoleum. We secured the double-wide leather booth in the back corner, jamming Joe into the inside seat where he couldn't easily escape. Within minutes, Rose had the table covered in thick ceramic mugs and a mountain of sandwiches. Joe didn't waste any time talking. He grabbed a sandwich with both hands and went to work. Thorne watched him for a second, then took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression turning serious as Rose headed back to the counter to give us some space. The humor from the office had faded, replaced by the sharp, focused look of a guy who knew a murder charge was still hanging over his head. All right, Jack, David said, leaning over the table, his voice dropping low. We got the big guy fed and your wife is an angel. Now, how do we want to handle this? Homicide isn't going to sit on their hands for long. I leaned back, lighting a Camel and letting the smoke drift up toward the ceiling. First thing we do is figure out who Judy Goldfinch really was. And while Sarge is digging into her background back at the office, you and I are going to take the DeSoto and pay a visit to the bar where you met her. She was sitting at the corner of the curved mahogany bar, Thorne said, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. Sleek blue dress, expensive perfume, but she was nursing a cheap gin and tonic like she was trying to make it last until the next century. She looked lonely, Jack. Or maybe just waiting for the right distraction. All right, I said, twisting my Camel out in the ceramic saucer. We have our starting line, but before we hit the downtown asphalt, we have a strategic retreat to handle. I nodded toward the inside of the booth. Joe had successfully demolished his pastrami sandwich, leaving nothing but a greasy sheet of butcher paper and a deeply unsatisfied expression. Come on, Russo, I said, sliding out of the bench. Time for the bear to go back to the cage. Like hell, Joe growled, trying to brace his hands against the table to hoist himself up. I'm in the middle of a homicide investigation. I ain't sitting in that office listening to the Underwood click all afternoon. You are, I said firmly, because if you rip those stitches, Rose is going to use my head for a punching bag, and I like my head exactly where it is. David, Polly, grab the heavy artillery. Despite his loud, highly colorful protests that echoed across the diner's linoleum, David and Polly flanked him again, locking their shoulders under his arms. We hauled a cursing, grumbling Joe Russo out of the diner, down the sidewalk, and back up the stairs of the agency completely against his will. See you tonight, dear, I said to Rose, who waved a goodbye. We dropped Joe back into his leather swivel chair where he slammed his fists onto his desk blotter. I'm a partner in this outfit, Morgan. This is mutiny. Save it for the funny papers, Joe, Sarge said without looking up from her typewriter. The moment the office door closed, she ripped the page she was working on out of the roller with a sharp clack. She picked up a slim manila folder from her desk and walked over to where David, Polly, and I were standing. I ran a few quick favors through the records desk at Central, Sarge said, her voice dropping into her no-nonsense briefing tone. Judy Goldfinch, 26 years old. She's got a brief local jacket, one arrest for public intoxication 6 months ago at a lounge on Wilshire. But the real friction is her domestic situation. She flipped the folder open, pointing a manicured finger at a typed sheet. She's got a bitter ex-husband named Johnny Goldfinch, Sarge continued. According to the police log, she filed 2 separate restraining complaints against him last year. The guy has a history of making nasty public threats. Neighbors reported him screaming outside her apartment building 3 weeks ago, swearing he'd make sure no other man ever looked at her again. Thorne rubbed his jaw, his eyes narrowing. A jealous ex with a violent streak. It's a classic setup. It's a lead, I corrected, looking over at Polly, who had moved from the couch to leaning against the doorframe. Sarge, keep digging into Johnny Goldfinch. Find out where he works, where he hangs his hat, and if anyone saw him downtown last night. Polly, you're with us. Let's go check out the Zephyr room. Polly just nodded, adjusting his fedora. We left Joe furiously bitching in his office and headed back down to the DeSoto. The Zephyr room was a completely different animal during the daylight hours. Without the low, smoky blue spotlights and the swell of a jazz piano, it looked like a sleeping giant. The velvet drapes were pulled back just enough for the afternoon sun to slice through the dust motes, illuminating rows of upside-down crystal glasses and pristine leather booths. A lone bartender in a crisp white apron was behind the long mahogany counter, cutting lemons and setting up the ice wells for the evening rush. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind us, and the bartender looked up, his eyes instantly tracking the cut of our suits and the angle of our hats. He recognized Thorne immediately. A flicker of nervous tension crossed his face, but he kept his hands moving on the cutting board. Prying eyes already came through here this morning, fellas, the bartender said, his voice low and cautious. I told the homicide dicks everything I know. We're private, pal, I said, sliding onto a bar stool and placing my investigator's shield flat on the polished wood. And we're just looking for the details the city boys might have missed. You remember my friend here from last night? The bartender looked at David, then sighed, dropping his paring knife into a tray. Yeah, I remember him. Look, I was busy last night. The theater crowd came in around 10, and the register was ringing off the hook. I didn't pay too much attention. Did the girl come in here to meet him? Polly asked, his voice coming cold and flat from the shadow of his brim. No, the bartender said, shaking his head. Judy was a regular customer. She usually sat at the end by herself. Last night she wasn't there to meet anybody special, but she and your pal struck up a conversation. He started buying the drinks, so she wasn't going to leave. A free ride is a free ride in this lounge. Did you see anyone else watching her? David asked, leaning forward. The bartender hesitated, his eyes darting toward the street entrance, before he leaned in a fraction closer. Like I told the cops, I saw them leave together around midnight, and that's all I know, the bartender whispered. But there was a guy, sat in the back corner booth by the velvet partition. He stayed there for 3 hours, barely touched his scotch, and he seemed very interested in the two of you. Every time Judy laughed or your friend reached for his wallet, this guy was taking notes with his eyes. I pulled a crisp $5 bill from my pocket and slid it across the mahogany. What did he look like? The bartender took the bill, folding it into his apron with a practiced flick of his wrist. Meticulous. Sharp gray suit, manicured nails, looked like an out-of-town businessman with money to burn. But he had a hard look to him. The kind of look that belongs to a guy who handles problems for people who don't want to get their own hands dirty. David's entire posture went rigid next to me. The color seemed to drain slightly from his sun-baked face as the bartender's description settled in. Did he have a small, jagged scar right under his left earlobe? David asked, his voice suddenly sounding like cracked ice. And did he smoke premium gold-tipped cigarettes? The bartender blinked, surprised. Yeah, he did. Smelled like expensive Turkish tobacco. You know him? David turned to me, his jaw locked so tight I could hear his teeth grind. It has to be Ray Miller, David said, the words coming out like a curse. He's an investigator out of Kansas City, a syndicate fixer. The Kansas City mob might have followed me to Los Angeles. He might be sore that I solved a case he was working on that sent one of his friends to the can. Chapter 4. The drive back from the Zephyr room was quiet. The hum of the DeSoto's engine did most of the talking while Thorne stared out the passenger window, his jaw still tight enough to crack a marble. Paulie sat in the back, a silent shadow under the brim of his hat, watching the LA traffic slide by. The rules of the game might have changed. This didn't seem like a local domestic mess anymore. It could be an imported infection. When we walked back into the office, the rapid-fire clack, clack, clack of Sarge's Underwood was still echoing off the walls. Joe was at his desk, a cigar unlit between his teeth, looking like a man serving a life sentence in a linen closet. Thorne, go grab a seat on the couch and let your brain catch up with your legs, I said, tossing my fedora toward the coat rack. Paulie, keep an eye on him. I'm going to see if the bear in the back room has calmed down. Thorne nodded, looking exhausted, and dropped heavily onto the leather sofa. Paulie leaned against the filing cabinet, sliding a fresh Camel between his lips. I stepped away from them, but I didn't stop in the front room. Instead, I bypassed Sarge's desk with a quick nod and slipped straight into Joe's inner office, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind me. The latch clicked shut, cutting off the sound of the typewriter. Joe looked up, his eyes instantly sharp. Well, what did the drink slinger say? I leaned over his desk, dropping my voice into a low, gravelly whisper. The girl was a regular, but she wasn't there for Dave. Someone else was, though. Meticulous guy in a gray suit, jagged scar under his left ear, smoking gold-tipped Turkish garbage. Dave says the description matches a guy named Ray Miller. Ray Miller? Joe repeated, squinting as he tried to place the name. Who the hell is Ray Miller? Dave says he's a big-time syndicate fixer back in Kansas City. An investigator who keeps the mob out of jail, I explained. Dave outsmarted him on a case back in Missouri and put one of Miller's boys in the Limestone Hotel. We think, or at least Dave suspects, that Miller might have followed him out here and is trying to frame him for this girl's murder as payback. Joe's unlit cigar shifted from one side of his mouth to the other. It's a hell of a suspicion, Jack. But it makes sense. It's too damn weird for a high-rolling Kansas City fixer to just happen to be sitting in the corner of an LA lounge watching our boy. Exactly. It's too much of a coincidence, I said. If Miller is in town, we need to know if he's working alone or if he's got local backing. I'm going to place a call. I reached across the mahogany desk and grabbed the heavy black receiver of Joe's private telephone line. Joe nodded, shifting his weight slightly to look through the frosted glass pane of his office door, keeping his eyes on Thorne and Paulie out in the front room. I dialed a number I didn't keep in any directory. It was a direct line that bypassed the standard operators, routing straight into the hills of Los Feliz. I had to do this privately, completely behind David's back, because I wasn't about to explain the realities of California to a guy from Missouri. David Thorne was a good man, a damn fine investigator, but he was a pretty by-the-books detective. Kansas City was a dangerous, bloody town, no doubt about it. But David had absolutely no clue how Los Angeles actually ran. He didn't know about the delicate, razor-thin tightrope we walked out here, or the fact that sometimes you had to talk to the devil to keep from getting burned. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered with smooth, quiet authority. Yeah. Dogface, it's Morgan, I said into the mouthpiece, keeping my eyes fixed on the grain of Joe's deskwood. Put me through to the Don. There was a brief, metallic pause, the sound of a heavy receiver being handed over, and then the calm, unmistakable voice of Don Pandolini came through the wire. Jack, Pandolini said, his tone carrying that cold, polite warmth that always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I trust Russo is on the mend. He is, Don Pandolini, and I appreciate you checking on him, I said quickly. But I'm calling on a piece of sudden business. A Kansas City investigator named Ray Miller just landed in town. We think he might be connected to the Midwestern Syndicate, and he might have set up an old friend of mine for a killing downtown last night. I need to know if the Kansas City boys are moving into your territory or if this guy is operating on an independent ticket." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock through the receiver. "The Kansas City people have not cleared any business in my city, Jack," Pandolini said, his voice dropping into a harder, colder register. "If they are operating under my sky without my signature, it is a grand disrespect. I have heard nothing of this, Mr. Miller, but I will put my people on the avenues. If a leaf falls from a tree in Los Angeles, I know about it. If I hear where this out-of-towner's laying his head, I will let you know." "That's all I ask," I said. "Thanks, Don." "Watch your step, Jack," Pandolini said smoothly. "Out-of-towners are sloppy, and sloppy people leave messy graves." The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered the receiver back onto the cradle, exhaling a long plume of tension. Joe turned his head from the door, looking back at me. "Well?" Joe asked. "Pandolini doesn't know him," I whispered, straightening my tie. "Says Casey didn't clear any business out here. But he's putting his people on the street to see if they can locate where Miller is staying." "Good," Joe grunted. "Because if that slick son of a bitch really is trying to frame Dave under our noses, I want a piece of him." I patted Joe's shoulder, turned the knob, and opened the door back up to the front office. Thorne was sitting on the couch, his head back against the cushions, while Sarge stood by his side holding a fresh manila folder. "All right, boys," I said, stepping back out into the center of the room and putting on my best professional face. "Let's see what the home front has for us. Sarge, what's the latest on the ex-husband?" Sarge tapped the edge of the manila folder against her palm. "Johnny Goldfinch works a machine line at a manufacturing plant down near the industrial tracks on the east side. He lives in a small apartment building just a few blocks away from the factory." "All right," I said, reaching into my pocket and jingling my car keys. "We'll go talk to him. See where he was last night." Thorne pushed himself up from the leather sofa, adjusting his rumpled cuffs, while Paulie silently fell into step behind us. We left Joe furiously chewing on his unlit cigar and headed back down to the street. The drive down to the industrial district didn't take long, but the scenery changed fast. The palm trees and neon of the boulevard gave way to smoke-belching stacks, corrugated steel warehouses, and rows of drab, identical apartment buildings meant for men who spent their lives punching a clock. We climbed the narrow, dingy stairwell of Goldfinch's building. The air smelled of stale cabbage and cheap pine cleaner. I stopped in front of apartment 2B and knocked hard on the chipped wood. A long moment passed before the deadbolt threw with a heavy metallic click. The door swung open to reveal a thick-necked man in a stained white undershirt and rumpled trousers. His hair was a bird's nest, and his eyes were bloodshot and heavy with sleep. The moment he saw the cut of our suits and the look on our faces, his jaw tightened into an angry scowl. "What do you want?" Goldfinch barked, blocking the doorway. I didn't answer. I just put a heavy hand against the wood, pushed my way past him, and stepped into the apartment. Thorne and Paulie followed me inside, closing the door behind them. The place was pathetic. It was scarcely decorated, smelling of sour laundry and old tobacco. There wasn't a single picture on the peeling wallpaper, no rugs on the stained floorboards, and the living room held nothing but a sagging armchair and a rusted floor lamp. It was pretty obvious his wife had gotten everything in the divorce. "Hey, you can't just barge in here," Goldfinch snapped, turning on his heel. He was practically vibrating with rage, clearly furious that we'd woken him up. "I was sleeping. I got another shift at the factory later tonight." "Relax, Johnny," I said, leaning one hip against the windowsill. "We just want to talk about Judy." The name hit him like a physical slap, but his face hardened instantly, any trace of shock turning into pure defensive venom. "I had nothing to do with it, Flatfoot," Goldfinch said, his voice dropping into a harsh growl. "I was getting off my shift when I found out she was dead." I eyed him closely, taking in the defensive posture, the clenched fists, and the complete lack of grief. You don't seem too shook about it, Johnny. Why should I be? Goldfinch sneered, crossing his thick arms over his chest. We were done. She stripped me bare and left me in this dump. I'm trying to pick up the pieces of a marriage that went on too long. If she went out to a bar and the slut got herself killed, that's her fault. She chose her company. David's eyes narrowed from the corner of the room, his soldier's gaze tracking the man's every micro-expression. Can you verify where you were last night? I asked, pulling out my pack of Camels but not offering him one. Sure. Go ask my boss at the plant, Goldfinch said, stepping toward the door and throwing it wide open to usher us out. I clocked in last night, got off at 6 this morning, and I have to be back at 6 tonight. The foreman keeps the cards. Now, unless you have anything else to ask, I'm going back to bed. The words hadn't even fully left Goldfinch's mouth before David crossed the room in 2 long, explosive strides. He closed the distance until he was inches from Johnny's face, his towering frame casting a dark shadow over the factory worker. The easygoing Kansas City detective was entirely gone. This was the infantryman who had survived the European theater, his eyes burning with a dangerous, quiet heat. I'm the guy they are trying to pin it on, David said, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that vibrated through the small room. And I know I didn't kill her. Goldfinch didn't back down, but his bloodshot eyes flicked nervously to the side, taking in Paulie and me flanking the doorway before he forced his gaze back to David. Yeah? Johnny sneered, his chest heaving under his stained undershirt. How do I know you didn't do it? Are you the guy she's been sneaking around with behind my back? David explained, his jaw locked tight as he held the man's gaze. I was at the bar, and she came up to me. We had a few drinks, and I walked her home. Well, aren't you the gentleman? Johnny snarled, a bitter, ugly grin twisting his face. He stepped back and gripped the edge of the apartment door, ready to end the conversation. When you do find the one that bumped her off, let me know. I'd like to buy him a drink. Before David could reply, Johnny slammed the door shut with a concussive bang that rattled the chipped frame and shook the dust loose from the hallway ceiling. The 3 of us stood in the dim, stale air of the tenement corridor for a beat, the sound of Goldfinch throwing the heavy deadbolt echoing from the other side of the wood. Paulie slowly adjusted the brim of his fedora, staring at the blank wood of the door. He seems nice, Paulie said sarcastically. Yeah, he's a prince, I muttered, turning on my heel and then heading back toward the narrow stairwell. Come on, let's get out of this fire trap. We walked down to the street, the heavy afternoon sun beating down on the DeSoto's black roof. The industrial district was noisy, the screech of metal from the nearby rail yards and the rhythmic thud of stamping presses acting as a backdrop to the storm brewing in David's mind. Thorne didn't get in the front seat right away. He leaned his hands on the warm metal of the passenger door, staring back up at the windows of apartment 2B. He didn't do it, Jack, David said, his voice back to its usual, calculating, professional register. He's a miserable son of a bitch, and he hated her guts, but that wasn't the face of a guy hiding a murder. That was just raw, unadulterated spite. His alibi at the factory is going to check out. I agree, I said, unlocking my side and sliding behind the wheel. Paulie climbed into the back, pulling out a fresh pack of cigarettes. Johnny Goldfinch is an anchor, not a sail. He's going to stay right in that factory dump, which means our compass is still pointing straight at Ray Miller. So what's the play? Paulie asked from the back seat, a small flame illuminating his face as he lit his smoke. If Miller is a syndicate fixer from out of town, he isn't going to be staying at a flop house. He's got mob money in his pockets. He'll be downtown, David said, finally getting into the car and slamming the door, close to the Zephyr room. Miller likes his comforts. He'll be registered under a fake name at one of the high-end hotels, the Grand Vista, the Biltmore, or maybe the Ambassador. I started the DeSoto, the engine roaring to life with a comforting mechanical rumble. We have 2 tracks to run. Some of our people are already scouring the avenues to find out where Miller is laying his head, while we wait for the phone to ring back at the office. You and I are going to check the registers at the Grand Vista. Polly, I want you to head down to the industrial plant and officially verify Johnny's time card with the foreman. I don't want any loose ends tripping us up later if the homicide dicks get ambitious. Chapter 5. The afternoon sun was relentless, baking the black leather of the DeSoto seats as we split up. Paulie caught a streetcar down toward the industrial tracks to run out the string on Johnny Goldfinch's factory alibi, leaving David and me to tackle the pavement downtown. We started with the high-end spots, the kind of places where a man with a heavy syndicate expense account would want to lay his head. We hit the marble lobby of the Biltmore, then cruised over to the Ambassador. At each mahogany desk, I slid a 10 across the counter while David laid out the description. Meticulous gray suit, manicured nails, gold-tipped Turkish tobacco, and that small, jagged scar right under his left earlobe. Every single time, the story was the exact same. The desk clerks shook their heads, pocketed the cash, and checked their guest registries. Nobody fitting that description had checked in. "He's a fucking ghost, Jack," David muttered as we walked out of the fourth hotel, the frustration finally leaking into his voice. He yanked his collar loose against the heavy LA heat. A professional like Miller doesn't just sleep on a park bench. He's in the city somewhere. "Let's go back to your room," I said, swinging my keys around my finger. "Maybe he's laying low in a smaller residential hotel. Let's get you cleaned up and we'll regroup." We drove over to the modest, mid-tier hotel where David had taken a room when he first rolled into town. It wasn't the Zephyr room, but it was clean and out of the way. Or at least it was supposed to be. The moment David turned the brass key in the lock of room 314, he stopped dead. The door wasn't fully latched. It gave way under his hand with a soft, hollow click. We stepped inside, hands instinctively drifting toward our jackets. The room hadn't been completely trashed, but it had been systematically worked over. The drawers of the dresser were sitting an inch open. David's shaving kit had been unzipped, the bottles shifted. His extra suit had been pulled from the hanger and hung back up just slightly askew. Someone had gone through his things with practiced, quiet fingers. David marched straight to his leather suitcase, popping the brass clasps. He dug through the interior pockets, his jaw tightening into a hard, pale line. "My spare pocket watch is gone," David said, his voice dropping into that dangerous infantry tone. "And the silver cigarette case my old man gave me before the war. He didn't just toss the place, Jack. He took things, personal things." "He's building his nest," I said, looking at the window frame. "He didn't want your money, Dave. He wanted things he can drop at a secondary crime scene or plant in a dumpster when the cops start looking for physical evidence to tie you to Judy." A sudden, sharp thought struck me. I turned on my heel and marched back down the carpeted hallway toward the lobby, David hot on my heels. The desk clerk was an older guy with thick spectacles, sleepily sorting the afternoon mail. I slammed my investigator's shield onto the counter, right over a stack of envelopes. "Out of curiosity, pal," I leaned in, keeping my voice low, but hard. "You see a guy come through here, matching this setup? Immaculate gray suit, manicured hands, smells like gold-tipped Turkish tobacco, got a small, jagged scar right under his left earlobe." The clerk blinked through his thick lenses, his eyes widening. "Why, yes. He checked in yesterday afternoon. Room 202, just one floor down from your friend here." David and I exchanged a sharp look. Miller hadn't just followed David to L.A. His arrogance was so massive that he had checked into the exact same hotel, right under David's nose, completely confident the local hicks would never think to look in their own backyard. "Has he been in today?" David pressed, leaning over the desk. "He returned early this morning," the clerk nodded, leaning in closer to whisper. "I noticed it because he looked quite a mess, honestly. He had fresh, angry-looking scrapes all over his face and his arms. Looked like he had been in a real nasty fight with someone. He went straight up to his room, and I haven't seen him since." "Come on," I said, pulling my shield back into my pocket. "Now let's get back to the office." By the time the DeSoto screeched to a halt in front of the agency, the late afternoon shadows were stretching long across the pavement. We walked up the stairs and into the front room, arriving at the exact same moment Polly walked through the door from the stairwell. But Polly wasn't the only one waiting for us. Standing by Sarge's desk, looking through a notebook, was Detective Lieutenant Garrity, the lead homicide investigator from Central Precinct. He looked up as the door clicked shut, his tired eyes tracking David immediately. "Morgan," the detective said, closing his notebook with a heavy snap. "Thorne, glad you walked in. Saves me the trouble of sending a squad car to hunt you down." I stepped into the center of the room, tossing my fedora onto Sarge's desk. "We've been doing some work of our own, Lieutenant. Did the autopsy report on Judy Goldfinch come in yet?" "Came in about an hour ago," Garrity said, rubbing the back of his neck. "And it's ugly. Her throat was cut. Clean slice, most likely from a sharp hunting knife or a switchblade. But the coroner noted something specific about the angle of the wound. From the depth and the trajectory of the cut, he's determined the killer was strictly left-handed." David didn't move a muscle, but I could see his shoulders drop a fraction. "There's more," Garrity continued, stepping closer. "She had heavy bruising all across her mouth and jawline. Looks like someone clamped a large hand over her face to keep her from screaming while they did the job. But Judy didn't go quiet. She had a massive amount of flesh and blood trapped beneath her fingernails. From the amount of skin she took with her, she put up one hell of a good fight before she went down. The killer is going to be marked up raw." David slowly reached down, unbuttoning his suit coat and pulling it back. He held his hands out, palms up, then flipped them over. "I'm right-handed, Lieutenant," David said, his voice steady and calm. "Always have been." Garrity eyed him heavily. "Strip the jacket, Thorne. Let me see your arms, your neck, and your face." David shed his jacket, rolling his sleeves up past his elbows. His skin was sun-baked and completely clear. No marks, no gouges, nothing but the fading scars of a rough life growing up on a Missouri farm and seeing combat. The detective inspected his neck and jawline, finding nothing but smooth skin. Polly stepped forward from the doorway, yanking his fedora off and tossing it onto the leather couch. "The ex-husband's story checks out perfectly, too, Lieutenant. I just came from the manufacturing plant on the east side. The foreman has Johnny Goldfinch clocked in on the machine line from 6 last night until 7 this morning. He never left his station, and the time card is ironclad. So the ex is out, and Thorne is clean," Garrity sighed, pulling out his notebook again and crossing a line through David's name. "Which means I'm back to a cold start and a DA, breathing down my neck." "Not exactly, Lieutenant," I said, leaning back against Sarge's desk. "Because while David doesn't have a scratch on him, the guy who checked into the room right below him yesterday afternoon does. A Kansas City syndicate fixer named Ray Miller. He came back to the hotel early this morning with his face and arms completely torn up from a fight. And he's currently sitting on a pile of stolen personal items he lifted from David's room to build a frame." Garrity's eyes snapped up, a sharp grin breaking through his tired face. "Ray Miller? A syndicate fixer? Hell, if he's got the marks and the motive, I'll take a half-dozen uniform boys right now, kick down the door of room 202, and put the cuffs on him before dinner." He turned toward the telephone, but I reached out, my hand landing firmly over the receiver, stopping him in his tracks. "Hold on, Lieutenant," I said, my voice dropping into a low, calculating register. "Don't place that call yet." Garrity frowned, looking at my hand, then up at my face. "What game are you playing, Morgan? The guy is sitting in a hotel room with the evidence. We go drop the hammer on him." "No," I said, looking over at David, then back to the cop. "Ray Miller is highly intelligent, but his biggest flaw is his arrogance. He thinks he's the smartest man in the state, and right now, he thinks he's completely invisible. He genuinely believes he's successfully ruining David's life, and he's going to keep moving pieces on the board to finish the job." A slow, knowing smirk spread across my face as the full architecture of the trap clicked into place. "We want David to stay the prime suspect," I explained. Keep his name on the wires. Let the papers print that homicide is looking for David Thorne. We play dumb. We let Miller think his frame job is working perfectly. And we use David as the bait to lure that arrogant son of a bitch right out into the open, where we can catch him holding the smoking gun. We rolled the DeSoto's windows down to catch whatever breeze the Los Angeles evening was willing to offer, parking half a block down from the hotel under the deep shadow of a sprawling shade tree. The sun was dipping low, bleeding a bruised purple and orange across the Pacific sky, but the pavement was still radiating pure heat. Garrity had agreed to the play. Now all we had to do was wait for the bird to fly. To pass the hours, we leaned back against the leather seat. It didn't take long for the silence to give way to the past. When you put 3 men in a car who survived the European theater, the conversation naturally drifts back to the grease, the mud, and the sheer absurdity of the military machine. I still say Paulie owes me $20 for that stunt in England, David said, a genuine smile, finally breaking through his tired face as he leaned his head back against the cushion. The time he tried to convince that British MP that his stolen Jeep was actually an official tactical delivery of whiskey. Paulie didn't even look up from the match he was holding to his cigarette, his face a mask of stone. It was tactical, Dave. The captain was sober. That's a company emergency. You spent 3 days in the stockade, Paulie, I laughed, shaking my head as the memory came back. And Joe and I had to bribe a supply sergeant with 2 cartons of Luckies just to get you out before the division moved out. Best 3 days of sleep I had the whole war, Paulie muttered, exhaling a thin stream of smoke out the window. We kept it up for a couple of hours, trading the kind of ugly, funny stories that only men who had been in the thick of it could appreciate. It kept the ice from freezing over David's mind. It reminded us that no matter how slick or smart this asshole thought he was, we had stared down much worse things than Ray Miller. Then, Paulie's hand subtly moved to the dashboard. He's moving. The banter died instantly. The easygoing veterans vanished, replaced by 3 professionals. Through the tinted glass of the hotel's side exit, Miller stepped onto the pavement. Even with the heat, his gray suit was pressed to a razor edge, but the illusion of perfection was officially cracked. Thick, fresh white bandages peeked out from the collar of his shirt, and more gauze was wrapped tightly around his forearms where poor Judy had torn into his skin. He looked around the street with an aggressive, sharp turn of his head, his massive arrogance practically radiating off him. He truly believed he was the only intelligent actor on the stage. I let him get a full block ahead before I twisted the key and let the DeSoto's engine purr to life. We kept our distance, lagging 2 or 3 cars back in the thickening twilight traffic. Miller walked with a brisk, confident stride, completely blind to the fact that the 3 of us were tailing his every step. He didn't check his 6. Why would he? In his mind, David Thorne was a desperate fugitive and the LA cops were standard-issue rubes. He led us straight back to the scene of the crime. When he turned the corner onto the street where Judy's apartment building sat, I pulled the DeSoto into a red zone near a busted fire hydrant. We watched through the windshield as Miller slipped down the alleyway, bypassing the police tape on the front door, and disappeared into the building. "Should we take him?" David whispered, his fingers twitching near his holster. "We can end this right now, Jack." "No," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We confront him now. He plays the out-of-town tourist who got lost. We want him to believe his plan is working flawlessly. Let him string the noose, Dave. Then we fucking hang him with it." 10 minutes later, Miller emerged from the alley. He adjusted his fedora, took out a gold-tipped cigarette, lit it with a silver lighter, and walked away with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just painted his masterpiece. The moment he cleared the avenue, the 3 of us moved. We slipped up the back stairwell and into Judy's apartment. The air inside was heavy, smelling of the police fingerprint powder and the lingering, tragic scent of cheap perfume and blood. We didn't look for clues, we looked for the payload. David went straight to the living room. He knelt down, reaching beneath the frayed fabric of a decorative armchair near the window. When he pulled his hand back, his silver cigarette case, The one his old man had given him was sitting in his palm. Left-handed drop, Paulie noted, tracing the angle of the chair. He shoved it under there so the cops would find it during a secondary sweep. Check the bedroom, I said. We walked into the small, cramped bedroom where Judy had met her end. The bed still ached in her blood where she bled out. There, sitting directly on the dust-covered nightstand, right next to a bottle of Vanish cold cream, was David's missing pocket watch. It was sitting out in the open, practically shouting for attention. Miller hadn't just planted it. He had staged it beautifully. "The arrogant son of a bitch," David growled, staring at his own watch. "Yeah, but he just handed us the match," I said. I stepped over to the wall phone in the hallway, lifted the receiver, and dialed Central Precinct, asking for homicide. It took 10 seconds for Garrity to come on the line. "Garrity," I said into the mouthpiece, keeping my eyes on the bedroom door. The buzzer just dropped the feathers. He hit the apartment. We found the silver cigarette case under a chair in the parlor, and the pocket watch is sitting right on the nightstand. On the other end of the wire, I could hear Garrity let out a low whistle. "He didn't waste any time, did he?" "He thinks he's smart, Lieutenant," I said, a cold smile cutting across my face. "Now it's your turn. Call your contacts at the Herald and the Times. Tell them homicide just conducted a follow-up search of the crime scene and recovered personal items belonging to the prime suspect. Leak it in time for the evening edition. I want the ink dry before he buys his morning paper." "You got it, Morgan," Garrity grunted. "I'll make sure it hits the stands before the theater crowds clear out." The line went dead. 3 hours later, the city was dark, illuminated only by the harsh glare of neon signs reflecting off the pavement. We were back at the office, sitting in the dark front room with the windows cracked. From the street below, the sharp, rhythmic cry of a paperboy cut through the LA night, his voice echoing off the brick facades. "Extra, extra! Read all about it. Killer at large. David Thorne suspect in Goldfinch murder. Police uncover crucial evidence at scene. Extra!" Paulie walked over to the window, looking down at the street where a delivery truck was dumping bundles of the evening edition onto the corner newsstand. "Well, Jack," Paulie said, his voice flat and dangerous in the dark room. "The bait is in the water. Let's see how hungry the bastard is." Chapter 6. "It's getting late, boys," I said, rubbing the bridge of my nose as the distant cries of the paper boys faded into the background traffic. "Let's call it a night. We need our wits about us tomorrow." Joe pushed himself up from his desk, grunting as his bad leg protested, but his eyes were fixed on David. "Thorne, you're not staying at that hotel with a killer sitting one floor down. You're coming back to my joint. The couch ain't luxury, but it's safe." David nodded, the exhaustion finally catching up to his towering frame. He reached down and offered Joe a steady shoulder, helping him navigate the office threshold. They left together, their boots echoing down the wooden stairwell. I turned back to the corner of the office where Hammett was curled up asleep on a stack of scratch paper. I scooped the big cat into my arms, letting him drape across my shoulder like a heavy wool scarf. "Get some sleep, Sarge," I said with a soft nod toward the front desk. "Tomorrow, the circus comes to town." "Good night, Jack," she said, already locking down her Underwood for the night. I drove the few blocks back to my apartment, the midnight air thick with the scent of coastal salt and exhaust. Hammett purred like a motor against my neck the whole way. Once inside, I set the cat down and walked straight to the telephone in the hallway. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the street lamps outside. I picked up the receiver and dialed Pandolini for the second time that day. The line rang twice before the deep, familiar rumble of Dogface answered. "Yeah. Dogface, it's Jack," I murmured into the mouthpiece, keeping my voice low. "Put me through to the Don, please. It's urgent." A moment later, the smooth, chilly authority of Don Pandolini filled the wire. "Jack, I assume your trap has a name now." "It does, Don Pandolini," I said, leaning my elbow against the wallpaper. The evening papers are running the frame job exactly the way Miller wanted. He thinks he's home free. I need a favor for the morning shift. I need you to send Dogface and Handsome over to the hotel, room 202. Have them drop in on Miller under the guise of finding out what a dirty Kansas City detective and mob fixer is doing operating in Los Angeles without clearing it first. I tightened my grip on the receiver, my voice dropping into a hard, merciless whisper. See if they can get a confession out of him. Tell them to beat it out of him, if they must. Or if they just want to have some fun with the son of a bitch. But get him to talk. On the other end of the line, Pandolini let out a dry, quiet chuckle that carried the weight of a cemetery gate closing. The Kansas City Dick needs to be taught a lesson about hospitality. It will be done, Jack. My boys will pay him a visit at breakfast. Thanks, Don, I said, and clicked the receiver shut. I walked into the dark bedroom, shedding my shoulder holster and tossing my rumpled suit coat over the chair. I crawled into bed, the cool sheets a welcome relief against the lingering heat of the day. Rose stirred beside me, her eyes half opening in the dark. She didn't ask about the day. She just smiled softly, pulled me close, and woke up just long enough to press a warm kiss against my lips before drifting back into sleep. After a day like this, there's no place I would rather be. The next morning started exactly like the previous one, cat landing in the middle of my chest, the city waking up under a heavy blanket of gray coastal overcast. I got up, stretched the kinks out of my back, grabbed Hammett by the scruff, and headed straight to the office. But the moment I turned the brass knob of the agency door, the familiar scent of Sarge's morning coffee was entirely overwhelmed by the sharp, pungent aroma of cheap cigars and expensive hair tonic. The front room was packed tight. Joe was leaning against his desk with a steaming mug. David was sitting on the leather sofa with his sleeves already rolled up, and Polly was hovering near the filing cabinets. But sitting comfortably in the two visitors' chairs, looking like a pair of high-fashion wolves in tailored wool, were Dogface and Handsome. Dogface was lazily tossing a silver $50 in the air, catching it with a rhythmic smack against his palm, while Handsome adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the office window. They looked entirely too pleased with themselves for 8 o'clock in the morning. I set Hammett down on the floor and closed the door firmly behind me. All right, boys, I said, looking across the crowded room. I take it breakfast was served? It was served, Handsome said, a razor-sharp grin splitting his face as he stopped admiring his tie in the glass. On a silver platter. David's brow furrowed, his gaze shifting from the two impeccably dressed men back to me. David, meet two of the city's best enforcers, and damn fine people to have on your side, I said, gesturing toward the pair. Dogface and Handsome. Enforcers? David asked, his voice dropping into a flat, skeptical register. As in mob enforcers? Yes, I answered simply, leaning back against Sarge's desk. You could say we have an ongoing respect and working relationship with Don Pandolini. David looked completely shocked. He stared at me, then slowly turned his gaze toward the corner of the room where Joe was holding his coffee. Jack, you have always been one to think the rulebook was only good for pissing on. But Joe, you, working with the mob? Joe took a slow sip of his coffee, completely unfazed by the judgment in the Kansas City detective's eyes. In their own way, David, they are some of the last honest men in this city. The force can be bought. The law is for sale in this town. With them, what you see is what you get. Besides, they are always happy to help when we have a problem such as we have. David let out a long breath, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the reality of how California actually ran. He looked at the three of us, then back to the two wolves sitting in our office. I don't like it, but if this is how you operate out here, I trust your judgment. Okay, boys, I said, turning my attention back to the couch. What did you find out? Dogface stopped flipping his silver $50, catching it one last time with a heavy slap against his palm. He leaned forward, laying it all out in that calm, gravelly voice of his. Miller claims to be in town on vacation, Dogface explained, his eyes narrowing slightly as he remembered the interrogation. He says he is not here on behalf of the Kansas City Syndicate, but he warned us about a detective in town that could cause trouble. I assume he means your friend here. Dogface nodded toward David, then continued. He confessed to setting up this detective, to put him away, so he wouldn't cause the syndicate any more trouble. But we know for certain that he is not on order from the syndicate on that. The Don already made a call to Kansas City. They go way back. Kansas City gave the green light on Miller if he becomes a problem. They said he has been causing more headaches lately than he has fixed. Joe let out a low, rough chuckle from behind his coffee mug. So the genius is flying completely blind. He thinks he's settling a personal score under the banner of his bosses, and his bosses just handed us the keys to his coffin. Paulie leaned forward from the filing cabinets, a cold smirk on his face. Arrogance is a son of a bitch. He's a rogue operator, David said quietly, the pieces finally coming together in his mind. He's trying to use my ruin as a golden ticket to get back in their good graces. If he locks me away for life, he proves to the Kansas City boys that he's still their top asset. I walked over to the window, looking down at the street below where the morning sun was finally starting to burn through the thick coastal fog. The trap was set, Miller's alibi from his own people was completely gone, and we held every high card in the deck. He's a man without a country, I said, turning back to the room, and he still has no idea that the evening papers he's probably gloating over right now were printed just for him. What's our next move, Jack? David asked, leaning against the leather sofa. The trap is set. Let's give the mouse some cheese, I said. Down on the floorboards, Hammett perked his head up at the word mouse. It could have been cheese, honestly. With that cat, you never really knew. First things first, I'm starving, I said, swinging my jacket back over my shoulders. Let's go grab some breakfast. We will discuss it over coffee. Sarge, come along. We need your strategic expertise. We grabbed Joe from his desk, and our motley crew, including Dogface and Handsome, headed down the street for the diner. We took over a pair of large booths in the back, the air thick with the comforting, greasy aroma of sizzling bacon and fresh hash browns. For the next hour, we enjoyed a big breakfast and shared some real laughs. It gave David a chance to finally get to know Handsome and Dogface as something other than looming underworld shadows. The story started flying over the clinking of silverware. Handsome, chuckling, threw a mouthful of eggs as he reminded David that their very first meeting with me had involved a lead-filled blackjack coming into sudden, violent contact with my thick skull. He had it coming, Thorne, Dogface grunted, though there was a rare grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The guy wouldn't have listened otherwise. Then Handsome started complaining about Hammett, recounting the months where the mean bastard used to systematically launch silent, airborne ambushes at him every single time he walked through the door. But it wasn't all lighthearted. As the plates were cleared away, the conversation drifted into the real history that forged our bond. David listened intently as we talked about the grim night we all worked together in the harbor to save a boatload of stolen children, and how we risked everything to permanently rid the world of a vicious, corrupt cop that started as a bunch of raped and murdered young women on the MGM backlot. Then we told him about our fallen rookie officer, Ben Hughes, whose death lit the fire under our asses to start the agency. By the time Rose poured a fresh round of steaming black coffee, David was looking at the two enforcers with a newfound quiet respect. Rose joined in on the laughs. Sarge asked for a piece of the cherry pie that she loves so much. Looks like we have a new member in our family, she said. Then, we got straight down to the business at hand. I leaned forward, wrapping my hands around my hot mug. I say we keep tracking him. He will slip up. Once he does, we take him. David took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he looked around the table. We turn him into the law? I let out a soft, humorless laugh, and I exchanged a knowing look with Joe and the boys. That's not really our style, I replied, the warmth leaving my voice as I thought about what Ray Miller had done to poor Judy in that bedroom. His corpse, maybe. I caught Rose's eye as she walked past with a fresh pot of coffee, giving her a quick wink. Miller is smart, but his arrogance is a terminal disease. He's going to want to see the police converge on your hotel room, Dave. He's going to want to watch the fallout from the shadows. Joe Russo leaned back, the vinyl booth groaning under his weight. "We need to set up a loose tail around the hotel, Jack. If he thinks David is still hiding out, or that the LAPD is actively hunting him, Miller's going to move to his next location to watch the fire he started." Dogface gave a slow grunt, crossing his massive arms over his tailored suit jacket. "Handsome, and I can stay on the street corners downtown. Miller already saw us this morning, but he thinks we were just shaking him down for operating in Pandolini's territory. He won't expect us to be sitting on his shoulder while he reads the paper." "Good," I said, tossing a few bills onto the table to cover the breakfast. "Paulie, you take the DeSoto and park it down by the industrial tracks near the hotel's back exit. David, you stay low at Joe's place for the next few hours. If Miller spots you on the street before we're ready to spring the lock, the whole damn architecture of the trap falls apart." Sarge swallowed her last bite of pie, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, her administrative mind already clicking into place. "I'll head back to the office and keep the lines open with Lieutenant Garrity at Central Precinct. If the papers generate any civilian tips, or if Garrity gets anxious, I'll take the message." "Let's move," I said, pulling my fedora down low as we stood up from the booth. Chapter 7. The neon sign for the Bristol Hotel flickered through the heavy LA overcast, casting a sickly green glow over the wet pavement. David and I were crammed into the front seat of the parked sedan across the street, the air inside thick with the smell of cold coffee and tobacco. My eyes were glued to the lobby entrance. We were supposed to be waiting for Paulie to get into position by the tracks, waiting for the trap to snap shut on its own time. Then the rhythm of the street changed. I caught a shape moving along the brick wall of the pharmacy next to the hotel. It was a trench coat I recognized all too well. Lieutenant Garrity. He was moving with his hand tucked inside his jacket, his eyes locked on the front doors of the Bristol. "What the fuck is Garrity doing here?" I muttered, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Sarge was supposed to keep him contained at Central. "He's trying to make a move on Miller," David said, his voice dropping into a tense, hard register as he leaned closer to the windshield. "The damn fool is trying to play the hero." Before I could even put my hand on the door handle to intercept him, the lobby door swung open. Ray Miller stepped out onto the sidewalk, pulling the collar of his coat up against the mist. He didn't look like a man who knew he was being hunted. He looked like a man who owned the sidewalk. But as Miller turned left toward the alley, he gave a subtle, practiced tilt of his head. He'd spotted Garrity's shadow on the brick. Miller didn't run. He just slinked into the darkness of the alleyway, slow and casual, baiting the hook. Garrity took the bait. He quickened his pace, stepping off the curb and disappearing into the same alley mouth. "Jack, we have to move," David barked, his hand already on his piece. "Wait," I hissed. "If we blow our cover now, Miller bolts and the whole architecture of the trap goes straight into the gutter." We watched the mouth of the alley, our breath fogging the glass. It took less than 10 seconds. Garrity walked past a recessed service doorway, and Miller materialized out of the dark like a phantom. There was no grand struggle, no exchange of hard-boiled dialogue. Miller just stepped up behind him, his right arm blurring in a tight, vicious arc. The long blade of a trench knife slipped cleanly between Garrity's ribs, burying itself deep into his back. Garrity didn't make a sound. The blade hit a lung, stealing the air right out of him before it could form a scream. His body went instantly limp, his knees buckling as Miller guided him down into the shadow of a row of garbage cans. Miller stepped back, completely unbothered. He wiped the blade on the hem of Garrity's coat, adjusted his hat, and walked right back out onto the main street, turning the corner toward the diner. From the casual stride of his boots, it was clear what he was thinking. This wasn't a compromised plan. To him, this was just a rogue local cop sniffing around where he shouldn't be, an inconvenient bug crushed under his heel. He still thought his frame job on David was pristine. Across the street, my heart was hammering a ruthless beat against my ribs. "Jesus Christ," David whispered, his face pale in the green neon light. "He just butchered a lieutenant in broad daylight." I stared at the empty mouth of the alley, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Garrity was lying in the dirt, drowning in his own blood, and the entire LA police force was about to descend on this block like a hornet's nest. Like clockwork, the police swarmed the scene. Within minutes, the alley was a sea of flashing red lights, screaming sirens, and slamming car doors. The thick coastal overcast seemed to press the noise right down onto the pavement. Uniformed officers were already pushing back the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered under the flickering hotel sign. Through the chaos, I spotted a familiar, imposing figure stepping out of a black sedan. It was my former chief, Bill Parker. He looked as sharp and unyielding as a marble monument, his eyes scanning the alley mouth with a grim intensity. I turned to the passenger seat. "Stay in the car, David. Don't move, don't look around, and keep your hat pulled down low. If they spot you now, it's over." David gave a tight nod, his hands gripping his knees. I opened the door, stepped out into the damp air, and adjusted my fedora before slipping through the perimeter of uniformed cops. I walked straight up to Parker, who was listening to a sergeant give a preliminary report. As I approached, Parker turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "I should have known if there was a dead body. You would not be far, Morgan," the chief said, his voice flat and completely devoid of surprise. "It's a messy town, Bill," I murmured, stepping up beside him where the noise of the sirens wouldn't drown us out. I wasted no time. I laid it out for him right there on the sidewalk. The frame job from Kansas City, Ray Miller's history, and the exact plan we had set up with Garrity to draw Miller out using the evening papers. Parker listened, his jaw tightening with every sentence. When I finished, he looked out at the crowded street, the weight of the badge heavy on his shoulders. "I can only hold off the dogs for so long, Jack," Parker said, turning back to me, his voice dropping into a low, deadly serious register. "But we now have a dead officer on our hands, and the DA will want blood." I looked him dead in the eye. "You can count on blood, Chief. You had better have a plan, Jack," Parker said, his finger jabbing toward my chest to punctuate the warning. "I want Miller, or even though Garrity cleared him, your friend Thorne takes the fall." I leaned back slightly, testing the water. "Do you trust me, Chief?" "No," Parker answered instantly, the word cutting through the damp air. "I don't, but I trust the results, and Morgan, we have had our issues. I can't deny that you were always a good cop. A bit hot-tempered, but a good cop." A faint, cynical smile touched the corner of my mouth. "Come on, Bill. That little incident that got me kicked off the force. Can you say you wouldn't have done the same?" Parker stared at me for a long, silent moment. The noise of the crime scene seemed to fade into the background. "I never questioned why you beat that child killer to death, Jack, and yes, I wanted to get my hands on the bastard myself," Parker said, his voice dropping into a rare, quiet confession. "But my hands were tied. The DA wanted you in prison, but I talked them down to simply stripping your badge." I looked at the man who used to hold my future in his hands, the old bitterness melting away into the reality of the street. "I don't hold a grudge about that, Bill." "Bullshit," Parker said, the hard edge returning to his eyes as he looked back toward the alley where Garrity's body lay. He took a deep breath, adjusting his coat. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. But I can't hold them off for long. Do what you do, Morgan." "You know I will, Bill," I said, giving him a tight nod. "By the way," Parker said, pausing as he looked over his shoulder toward the flashing red lights, "I heard Russo was shot and is on desk duty. How is he taking it?" "Like a bear with a sore ass," I replied. The chief let out a rare, low chuckle. "Yeah, that does not surprise me. Now, get the hell out of here, Morgan. Time is ticking." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned my back on the sirens and walked briskly through the perimeter of uniformed cops, keeping my face down until I reached the DeSoto. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and ground the gears as I threw the car into reverse. David looked at me, his eyes wide and anxious under the brim of his hat. "What's the word, Jack? We going to jail?" "Not yet," I said, stepping hard on the gas as we cleared the curb, but the clock just started running double time. That was Chief Parker. I had to lay the news on him about what we were doing with Garrity. He's going to buy us some room, but his leash is short. I ripped the steering wheel to the left, cutting down a side street to avoid the incoming fire trucks. We should go back to the office and come up with a plan. David just nodded, staring out at the blurred city lights as the realization of a dead lieutenant settled over the car like winter frost. When we pulled up to the agency, the lights upstairs were burning a bright, anxious yellow against the dark sky. We took the stairs two at a time. The moment I pushed the brass knob and opened the door, the bell jingled, and I saw Polly was already back, pacing the floorboards by the filing cabinets. Sarge was at her desk, her fingers hovering over her underwood like she was waiting for a countdown. Joe looked up from his desk, his gruff face etched with worry. "We heard the sirens downtown, Jack. What the hell happened?" "Miller got to Garrity," I said simply, tossing my fedora onto the coat rack. "He stabbed him in the alley. Garrity's gone." The room went dead silent. Joe slumped back into his chair, a low curse escaping his lips. I didn't let the air stay heavy for long. I turned straight to Sarge's desk. "Sarge, call up Dogface and Handsome. We need to assemble the team to come up with a plan." It didn't take long for Dogface and Handsome to show up. The door barely hit the frame before they stepped into the office, their heavy wool coats damp from the LA mist and their faces grim. Once they heard about Garrity, the wolves were ready to hunt, and they immediately started spitballing ideas. Dogface leaned his massive frame against the wall, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "We smash in the hotel door, throw a sack over his head, and drag him back to Pandolini's basement. He'll talk before the sun comes up." Handsome leaned against the window, adjusting his cuffs with a cold, humorless smile. "Too much heavy lifting. I say we just kick in the hotel room door and blast him right where he sits. Short, sweet, and permanent." Over by the filing cabinets, Paulie let out a dry smirk. "Or we could just introduce him to Veronica. Have him spend a night with her. The bastard will kill himself by morning." Jack, David, and Joe listened to the banter, but none of it was hitting the mark. A blunt hit or a loud shootout at the Bristol Hotel was exactly what would bring Parker's uniform cops swarming down on our necks before we could get a confession. We needed something cleaner, something sharper. We all knew we could come up with something better. Then the sudden, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the typewriter stopped. The silence in the room was heavy. Sarge rolled the paper up a single notch, looked up from her underwood, and let her gaze drift across the room, settling on the towering detective from Kansas City. "I think I have an idea," Sarge said, her voice cool, steady, and commanding the entire room. "David, you make yourself seen at your hotel room. Let him know you're still breathing and out in the open. Then go back to the lounge you were at the night the girl was killed. I will be waiting there for you. We have some drinks. Make a scene of it. Make sure he sees us. Then you leave the lounge to take me home. At my apartment will be the rest of you, waiting in the dark to take him. If he takes the bait." The room went quiet as her words hung in the air. It was a beautiful piece of staging, a perfect theatrical trap for a man blinded by his own arrogance. I chewed on the inside of my cheek, looking from Sarge back to Joe. "I don't know, Sarge," I said, stepping forward and resting a hand on the corner of her desk. "Are you sure you want to be involved in this? It could get dangerous. Miller just butchered a cop in broad daylight. The man is entirely unpredictable." "I'm sure," Sarge said, her voice steady as she looked me dead in the eye. "My apartment is a 10-minute walk from the lounge." "I still don't like it," I said, leaning over her desk, my jaw clenched. The image of Garrity bleeding out in that fucking alley was still too fresh. "It's the best idea we've come up with," David said from the corner of the room. He stepped forward, the neon from the street catching the hard angles of his face. He was right, and it galled me. Joe chewed on the end of an unlit cigar, looking between all of us before finally nodding. "Okay, but we have to plan it out correctly. Where do you want me?" "Keeping your desk company," I said, pointing a finger at him. Joe's legs still gave him hell, and a tactical stakeout in a dark apartment wasn't the place for a man who couldn't light out of a back window if things went sideways. I took a deep breath, looking around the room at the heavy hitters we had assembled. "We'll do it. Polly, Handsome, Dogface. You three be waiting at Sarge's apartment. Dave, Sarge, and myself will go to the lounge, make it look like we are having a good time. I will leave 15 minutes before you two. If it is a 10-minute walk to the apartment, that gives me 5 minutes to get in place. We have to try to take him in alive, David interjected, his voice cutting through the tactical blueprint. The room went dead cold. Dogface shifted his bulk against the wall, and Handsome let out a soft, mocking breath. Paulie just stared. That was not typically how any of them did things. In our line of work, a problem like Ray Miller usually left LA in a pine box, not a squad car. David saw the resistance in their eyes and doubled down, his voice cracking with the sheer weight of what he'd lost. It's the only way to clear my name. He was right. A dead man couldn't talk to Chief Parker, and a dead man wouldn't stop the DA from pinning everything on a Kansas City out-of-towner. Reluctantly, they agreed. Heads nodded, slow and grim. They would try not to kill the bastard. Chapter 8. We do it tonight, I said, the finality of the words cutting through the cigar smoke. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and handed David a few bucks. Take a cab back to the hotel. Hang out for a couple hours. Make it look like you are moving back into your room. At 9, walk to the lounge. Sarge and I will be there. I will sit at the bar. Sarge, you sit at the table behind me so I can make a move if the son of a bitch tries anything. I turned my attention back to David, who was pocketing the cash. David, when you come in, grab a stool next to mine, order a drink, and relax. Give it a few minutes, and Sarge, walk up to the bar, start up a conversation with Dave, bring him back to your table. At 9:30, I will leave and walk to the apartment. At 9:45, you two walk out. If he follows, the trap is set. I looked between the two of them, making sure they were memorizing the timestamps. When you get to the apartment, David, like a gentleman, walk Sarge to the door and try not to get fresh. She might punch you in the nose if you try. A ghost of a smile flickered across Sarge's face, but her eyes stayed sharp. Walk down the street and find a place to watch, I continued, tapping my knuckle on the desk. Sarge, once David gets down the street, go inside. If the bastard takes the bait, he walks right into a trap. They all agreed. There were no more objections, no more spitballing. The blueprint was locked in. David adjusted his coat, gave a quiet nod to the room, and headed down the stairs to catch a cab back to the hotel. The clock was officially ticking on the biggest gamble of our lives. At 8 o'clock, we got the guys set up in Sarge's apartment. To look at it, the place was surprisingly girly for Sarge. Flowers in a vase, lace coasters on the tables, and a soft, clean scent that didn't belong anywhere near the cigar smoke of the agency. There are drinks in the icebox and a television if you get bored, Sarge jabbed, crossing her arms as she looked over the heavy hitters occupying her living room. I'm sure none of you know what to do in a lady's apartment. Handsome leaned back against a floral patterned chair, adjusting his tie with his usual slick smirk. I know what to do in a lady's apartment, just not your apartment. Sarge didn't even blink. Just don't try on any of my clothes. You would stretch them out. Especially you, William. Dogface just grumbles from the sofa, his massive frame looking entirely out of place against her furniture. I make no promises. All right, time to get down to business, I said, cutting through the banter before the boys got too comfortable. I gave Sarge a final nod, walked out of the apartment, and headed down the street to the lounge to get into position. When I got there, the place was dim, thick with the low murmur of jazz and the clinking of glasses. I took a stool at the bar and gave the room a good, careful look over through the mirror. My chest tightened. In a dark booth in the corner sat the son of a bitch himself, Ray Miller. I ordered a drink from the bartender, keeping my posture relaxed, trying to look like a tired guy who just came in for a beer after a long day at the office. 5 minutes later, the door jingled. Sarge walked in, looking sharp and entirely unbothered. She ordered at the bar, paid the man, and took her seat at the table right behind me, quietly sipping a rum and coke. A few minutes passed, the tension in my shoulders building, and then David walked in. He played it perfectly, low hat, casual stride. He sat down at the bar, leaving exactly one empty stool between him and me, and ordered a shot of whiskey and a beer. Right on cue, Sarge stood up from her table, walked up to the bar right next to David, and struck up a conversation. David played along beautifully, ordering them both another round, and after a minute of easy chatter, they made their way back to the table behind Jack. Through the reflection of the liquor bottles, I kept my eyes glued to the dark booth in the corner. I noticed the man in the dark taking a concerning, sharp interest in what the two behind me were doing. His head was turned, his eyes tracking David and Sarge like a wolf locking onto a target. This just might work. The minutes crawled by like molasses, measured only by the low drone of a saxophone over the lounge speakers and the steady tick of the clock above the bar mirror. I kept my face turned toward my beer, but my eyes never left Ray Miller's reflection. He was leaning forward now, the shadows of the corner booth cutting across his sharp, angular face. Then the lounge band shifted tempos, sliding into a slow, smoky jazz number. To my surprise, Sarge stood up from the table, smoothed out her skirt, and offered David her hand. David blinked, looking like a man who had just been handed a live grenade. But he couldn't exactly say no without breaking character. He let her lead him out onto the small, dimly lit dance floor. Within 10 seconds, it was a beautiful disaster. David possessed the towering height of a Kansas City detective, but he had the grace of a water buffalo on ice. He kept shuffling his feet a beat too late, stiff as a wooden plank. Looking terrified, he was going to stomp right through Sarge's open-toed shoes. Sarge just smiled patiently, guiding him around the floor like a tugboat steering a cargo ship. I caught David's eyes darting toward the bar in pure agony, and I couldn't help it. I let out a quiet, amused chuckle into the rim of my glass. But out in the corner booth, the comedy didn't matter. Ray Miller was completely locked in. He was leaning forward, his eyes tracking David and Sarge's awkward rhythm like a wolf marking a target. At exactly 9:30, I drained the last drop of my beer, threw a few coins onto the counter, and stood up. I didn't look back at the dance floor. I just adjusted my fedora, turned on my heel, and walked out the front door, letting the bell jingle behind me. The cool night air hit me like a slap. I quickened my pace, cutting down the sidewalk with my hands shoved deep into my trenchcoat pockets. The 10-minute walk back to Sarge's apartment took exactly 8. I took the stairs 2 at a time, slipping into the dark hallway and letting myself into her place without a sound. Inside, the television was off. The room was dead silent, drowned in pitch black save for the amber streetlights bleeding through the lace curtains. "He's at the lounge," I whispered into the dark. "He took the bait. Everyone get in position." A massive shadow shifted near the hallway. Dog face, his jaw set, a heavy iron pipe in his hand. Handsome clicked the safety off his piece, near the kitchen door, his silhouette slick and unbothered. Polly stepped into the bedroom doorway, melting into the dark. We waited. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the pavement below. I crouched by the edge of the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. Through the mist, I saw David and Sarge walking down the street. David was playing his part beautifully, leaning in, playing the relaxed, oblivious gentleman. But 50 paces behind them, sliding through the shadows of the brick buildings like a ghost, came the trenchcoat. Ray Miller. His hand was tucked inside his jacket, his stride long and deliberate. David walked Sarge right up to the front stoop of the apartment building. He paused, tipping his hat to her with a quiet word, keeping his hands to himself just like we agreed. Sarge offered a soft, rehearsed smile, turned the brass key in the lock, and stepped inside the building, shutting the heavy door behind her. David didn't linger. He turned on his heel and walked briskly down the street, disappearing around the far corner to find a vantage point. The street went completely still. A moment later, Miller stepped out of the shadows and paused at the base of the stoop. He looked down the street where David had vanished, then looked up at the second-story window of Sarge's apartment. To his crooked mind, this was the jackpot. David was isolated, the girl was alone, and he could finish the frame job once and for all. We heard the heavy front door downstairs click open. Then came the slow, rhythmic creak of the wooden stairs. Step, step, step. Every man in the room stopped breathing. I reached inside my coat and wrapped my fingers around the cold, comforting grip of my .45, my heart hammering a ruthless rhythm against my ribs. The footsteps reached the landing outside Sarge's door. A long, agonizing silence followed. Miller was listening, sniffing the air like a hound. Then came the soft, metallic scratch of a lockpick sliding into the keyhole. The tumblers fell with a dull, sickening click. The doorknob turned. The door swung open on silent hinges, letting a sliver of the hall light cut across the hardwood floor. Miller stepped into the room, his long trench knife already drawn, the blade gleaming dull silver in the dim light. He took one step inside, his eyes searching the dark for Sarge. Before he could take a second, the heavy door slammed shut behind him, and the click of the deadbolt echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Don't move a muscle, Miller," I growled, stepping out of the shadows directly in front of him. The heavy barrel of my .45 leveled right between his eyes. Miller froze, his eyes widening as the trap snapped shut. From the kitchen, Handsome stepped out, his piece aimed flat at Miller's ribs. From the hallway, the massive bulk of Dogface materialized, blocking any hope of retreat. Miller's gaze flicked from me to the wolves surrounding him. The arrogant smirk died on his face, replaced by the cold realization that he wasn't the hunter tonight. But he was a cornered rat, and cornered rats always bite. His arm twitched, his knuckles tightening on the hilt of the trench knife, as if he were actually stupid enough to try and cut his way out. "We need him alive," I reminded the room, my voice low and dangerous. Before the words could even clear my teeth, Dogface closed the distance. There was a dull crack as the heavy pipe in his hand made contact with Miller's head. The knife clattered to the floorboards, and Miller collapsed like a sack of wet flour, completely unconscious before he even hit the rug. Dogface stood over him, a devious smile on his face, looking down at the crumpled hitman with absolute disgust. "He'll live," Dogface said. Chapter 9, Ray Miller's head must have felt like a cracked walnut. As the fog finally cleared from his eyes, the first thing he registered wasn't the dim overhead light or the heavy rope I'd used to bind his arms to the straight-back chair. It was the rhythmic, metallic bite of Sarge, clacking away at the underwood. Clack, 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 ding. We had him right in the middle of the office. Across the room, Sarge sat hunched over her desk, her fingers moving across the keys with cool, unbothered precision. "Tell that bitch to knock it off. I have a headache," Miller hissed, his voice thick and dripping with venom. I didn't even have to move. For a man who relied on a pair of wooden crutches to get around, Joe could shift like a sudden thunderstorm when he was riled. He swung his weight forward, pivoting on his one good leg, and brought the heavy wooden handle of his right crutch around in a vicious, sweeping arc. The wood connected squarely with the side of Miller's mouth with a sickening crack. The force of the blow nearly sent Joe off balance, his shoulder clipping the edge of a filing cabinet as he caught himself. But the damage was done. Two bloody teeth skipped across the hardwood floor, clinking against the baseboard. "We do not speak to Miss James like that," Joe said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl as he reset his crutches under his arms. Sarge didn't stop typing, but I caught the sly smirk flickering across her lips as she slammed the carriage return. She reached up, pulled the completed page free with a sharp zip, and smoothly loaded a clean, blank sheet of paper into the roller. I stepped out of the shadows, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, my gaze dropping to the blood on the floor before locking onto the hitman. "Time to talk, Miller," I said. Miller spat a glob of crimson onto his own collar, a defiant, crooked grin stretching across his swollen lips. "I have nothing to say to you. To any of you. With one phone call, I could have this place set ablaze, with all of you in it." From the corner of the room, the massive silhouette of Dogface materialized, his hand still holding the iron pipe. "Is that so?" he rumbled, leaning forward. We wouldn't even have to make a call to make a shit stain like you disappear. I raised a hand, cutting the enforcer off, and stepped directly into Miller's line of sight. Listen, you only have two choices. Leave in a squad car, or leave in a fucking box. That is the only way you leave this room. Miller sneered, pulling his head back, and spat a mouthful of blood right at my wingtips. I didn't flinch. Instead, I let a cold, mocking smile spread across my face. I shook my head, looking down at the bastard with pure pity. Did you really think your idiotic plan would work? The word hit exactly where I knew it would. For a high-level syndicate fixer who prided himself on being the smartest wolf in the yard, the insult was a direct blow to his ego. Miller's eyes flared with sudden, ugly rage. Idiotic, Miller barked, his chest heaving against the ropes. It was a brilliant plan. I found out from an insider in Kansas City that Thorne was taking a trip out here. So I bought a train ticket. If I could keep him in Los Angeles, I wouldn't have to worry about him fucking up my business back home. I was simply going to kill him. But when I saw him with the girl, I had a better plan. Frame him for a murder. That way he is not only disgraced, but also on his way to the gas chamber. The room went dead silent, save for the final heavy thud of Sarge's finger hitting the period key on the underwood. David Thorne stepped forward from the dark hallway, his face pale but his eyes burning with a righteous intensity. You get that, Sarge? I got it, she said cleanly. She rolled the roller up, pulled the fresh sheet of paper out of the typewriter, and walked it across the room, handing the typed confession straight to David. David picked up a fountain pen from the desk, uncapped it, and forced it between Miller's bound, twitching fingers. He held the paper flat against a clipboard right under Miller's nose. Sign, David commanded, his voice shaking with the sheer weight of the nightmare he'd been living. I'm not signing a damn thing, Thorne, Miller snarled, his eyes bulging as he glared up at the Kansas City detective. Not for you, not for anybody. Fuck you. Fuck all of you. With a wet gasp, Miller reared back and spat directly into David's face. Before David could even raise a hand to wipe his cheek, I made my move. In one fluid, blinding motion, my heavy .45 automatic cleared my holster. I slammed the cold steel barrel hard against the center of Miller's forehead, pressing his head back against the wooden slats of the chair with a brutal, metallic thud. The hammer was already pulled back, clicking into place with a sound that signaled the absolute end of the line. The room froze. I could feel the blood draining from my face, leaving me entirely numb, my voice dropping into a flat, frightening tone that made even Dogface shift his feet. I'm not as diplomatic as Mr. Thorne, I said, my thumb resting steady on the safety. I wouldn't lose a wink of sleep over blowing your fucking brains all over this office. I leaned in closer, digging the barrel of the .45 deep into his skin until it left a red ring on his forehead. You will either sign this with that pen, I whispered, or I will write it in your fucking brain matter. If I were you, I would sign it, David said, his voice low, cutting through the thick tension in the room. He was looking at Miller, but he could see by the look in my eyes that this wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what I was capable of when a monster pushed me too far. Miller's gaze flicked between the black void of my .45 barrel and the pen in his hand. The arrogance finally drained out of him, leaving his face pale and slick with sweat. With trembling fingers, he pressed the pen to the clipboard and scribbled his name at the bottom of the page. I'll kill you all for this, Miller hissed, spitting the words through his broken teeth. From a cell in San Quentin, I asked with a smirk, finally lowering the weapon and easing the hammer back down. I walked over to the desk, picked up the heavy black receiver of the telephone, and dialed Chief Parker's home number from memory. It rang out into the quiet morning 5 times before a gravelly voice finally picked up. Parker. Bill, it's Jack, I said, leaning my hip against the edge of the desk. It's 5 in the morning, Morgan. This better be good, the tired chief grumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Get your old ass out of bed, round up a couple men, and meet me at the agency office. I have a gift for you. There was a long pause on the line, followed by a heavy, defeated sigh. Have a cup of coffee ready, or I will shoot you and Russo. I'll hand it to you myself, I replied, and slammed the receiver back onto the cradle. 20 minutes later, the blue and white silhouette of a squad car pulled up on the street below. Chief Parker and 2 night patrol officers marched up the stairs and walked right through our front door. True to my word, I handed the chief a steaming ceramic mug the second he crossed the threshold. He took a long, desperate sip, and his eyes practically popped out of his skull. He let out a ragged cough. Jesus Christ, Jack, you could start a Chevy with this. I couldn't help but laugh. We call that the Sarge special. Parker shook his head, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. What is this surprise you called me about? It's in my office, I said, tilting my head toward the back room. I led the way, with Parker, his 2 patrolmen, and Sarge following close behind. We walked into the room where Miller was still tied tightly to the straight-back chair, looking thoroughly beaten and miserable. Meet Ray Miller, I said, gesturing to the chair. The dog that killed the girl and your homicide, Lieutenant. Sarge stepped forward, entirely professional, and extended her hand. Here's a signed confession. Parker took the paper, his eyes skimming over the neat lines Sarge had clacked out on the underwood, down to the bloody thumbprint and jagged signature at the bottom. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed. I'm afraid to ask how you got this, Jack. It's best you didn't, I replied flatly. Parker accepted that with a grunt, then looked over at the corner where David was standing. Thorne, looks like you're off the hook. David just gave a quiet, exhausted nod. The weight of the world was finally off his shoulders. Parker turned back to his patrolman, pointing a thumb at the chair. Boys, drag this piece of shit out to the car. The 2 officers moved in, untying Miller and hauling him up by his armpits. Miller groaned, his feet dragging across the floorboards as they marched him out of the office. Parker lingered by the doorway for a second, adjusting his hat. He looked at Joe, then back at me. Jack, I meant what I said yesterday. You're a damn good detective. You too, Russo. Joe offered a tired, respectful nod from his crutches. Thanks, Chief. I leaned against my desk, crossing my arms, and let a sly grin spread across my face. Get out of my office. Parker chuckled, turned on his heel, and headed out the door. A moment later, the squad car door slammed shut down on the street, and the engine roared to life as they drove off into the L.A. dawn, taking Ray Miller with them. Everybody, take the day off. We need some rest, I said, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Everyone was more than ready to clear out. David headed back to his hotel to finally get some sleep without a murder charge hanging over his head, while Dogface and Handsome drifted back to Pandolini's mansion. Sarge gave the office one last look before heading back to her own apartment to clean the blood off the floorboards from where Miller had gotten cracked in the head. Once the office was empty, I picked up Hammett, tucked the heavy cat under my arm, and locked up. I walked down to the DeSoto and drove the few quiet blocks down the street to my apartment. Rose was already down at the diner working the morning rush, so the cat and I had the mattress entirely to ourselves. For the first time in days, sleep actually came fast. It was like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Well, other than the 14 pounds of purring cat sitting dead center on my chest. Chapter 10. I awoke the next morning with Hammett pawing at my face to see if I was still alive, and the urge to piss so severe I was afraid my bladder was going to burst. I must have been sleeping soundly. I never felt Rose go to bed or get up for work this morning. After my much-needed morning piss and the petting demanded by the cat, I shaved and started getting dressed. As I was slipping on my boots, the phone on the nightstand rang. I reached over and scooped up the receiver. It was David. My train leaves out tonight, David said, his voice sounding lighter than it had in days. Meet me at the diner, call the rest of the crew. All right, I'll meet you there, I said. I called up the office first. Joe and Sarge were already there, and Polly walked in about the time Sarge answered the phone. Meeting at Rose's, all must attend, I said, putting on the authority of the boss. Next, I dialed Pandolini's place and got a hold of Handsome and Dog Face. David is going home tonight. Wanted to see you before he goes. I'm heading to the diner right now. By the time I pulled up and walked through the door of the diner, everybody else was already there, piling into our favorite booth. The dark cloud of Ray Miller was no longer hovering above our heads, and the energy in the room felt entirely different. "It's about time you woke up," Rose said, stepping up to the table above the noise of the breakfast rush. "I don't think an earthquake would have stirred you." "Good morning, dear," I said, walking right up to her and giving her a kiss. "Now, that's some service," a trucker sitting at the counter hollered over, grinning into his mug. "You have to be a good tipper to get that kind of service," Rose joked back, flashing him a smile. I sat down at the end of the booth as my wife, it's still funny to say, started taking our orders. She set out clean cups and filled them to the brim with fresh coffee. We laughed. We told jokes. With the wolves and the agency guys all sitting at the same table, the conversation naturally drifted back to the old days, and we started trading stories about our army days. By the time my plate arrived, I realized I was absolutely starving. I cleared the eggs, ham, and hash browns in no time. But even though he was laughing and joking with the rest of the boys, I could see a lingering sadness in David's eyes. "What's the matter, Dave?" I asked quietly, leaning in so the others at the table couldn't hear over the din of the kitchen. He looked down at his coffee mug, spinning it slowly on the formica. "I just wish the trip had gone better. I wanted to come out here, see some of my old friends, and maybe try to screw a movie star." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Well, it wasn't under the best circumstances, but you did get to spend time with us. As far as the other thing, well, I don't know if I can help you with that." David smiled faintly, then looked back up at me. "I know Joe isn't up for it with his leg, but would you and Rose take me to the station tonight to see me off?" I reached over and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Brother, it would be an honor." After breakfast, I wasn't going to let David leave town on a sour note. The man had spent his vacation dodging a frame job and staring down the barrel of a state execution. The least LA could do was show him a decent time before he went back to Missouri. I loaded him into the DeSoto and took him on a grand tour of the city. We started in Hollywood, walking the pavement outside Grauman's Chinese Theater, so he could look at the handprints and footprints of the stars stamped into the cement. From there, we took the long way around to see the major studio gates, cruising past the backlots that manufactured the country's dreams. Eventually, we crossed over the hills into Burbank, pulling up near the Disney lot. David leaned his elbow on the window frame of the DeSoto, looking out at the clean, modern studio buildings. "Did I ever tell you that my mother worked for Disney?" he asked casually, watching a couple of animators walk across the pavement. I blinked, shifting the DeSoto into neutral. "Your mother worked for Walt Disney?" "Sure did," David said with a faint smile. "She answered phones for him back at Laugh-O-Gram in Kansas City, before he packed up his cardboard suitcase and made his way out here. She always went on about a damn mouse he kept right at his desk. Claimed the thing was a nuisance." I chuckled, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel. "No, I guess you never told me that." We spent the rest of the afternoon driving around, bullshitting and letting the warm California breeze blow the last remnants of Ray Miller out of our heads. By the time the sun started dipping low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, we headed back to the agency office. The whole crew met us there. We cleared off the main desk, dragged over some extra chairs, and broke out a fresh deck of cards. For the next few hours, the office was loud with the sounds of snapping cardboard, clinking glasses, and traded insults. We played poker for nickel and dime stakes. I watched David closely out of the corner of my eye. I had a sneaking suspicion the son of a bitch was actively cheating me and the boys, but he was doing it with such an easy practice grace that I didn't say a word. He needed the pocket money for the long train ride home anyway. Paulie threw his cards down with a theatrical groan after David raked in another pot. "I'm being robbed blind by a hillbilly in a Sears suit," he complained, though there was a grin tugging at his mouth. "Maybe if you spent less time looking at your watch and more time reading the table, Paulie, you'd actually win a hand." Sarge shot back from the corner of the desk, where she was nursing a small glass of whiskey. "Watch your mouth, Sarge," Paulie joked, holding up a finger. "Or I'll tell Veronica you're bullying me." "Veronica would tell me to hit you harder," Sarge replied without missing a beat. dropping a word that would have made a merchant marine blush. I choked on my coffee, laughing. Jesus, Sarge, where did you learn a vocabulary like that? The United States Army, Jack, she said, raising her glass to me with a cool, proper lady smile. The infantry has a way of expanding your horizons. Joe let out a rare, booming laugh from his chair, leaning his crutches against the wall. Even Dogface and Handsome were grinning, pouring themselves another finger's worth of rye. For a few hours, we weren't private dicks, enforcers, or fixers. We were just a bunch of guys who had been through the meat grinder together, sending off one of our own with a pocket full of cash and a room full of laughs. After the cards were put away and the last of the rye was gone, I dropped David off at his hotel so he could grab his bags and check out. I headed back to the apartment to pick up Rose, who had already changed out of her diner uniform and looked beautiful. We drove back together in the DeSoto, picked up Thorne and his heavy luggage, and made our way down to Union Station. The station was a bustling cavern of marble and leather, filled with the echoes of steam engines and shouting porters. Since we still had plenty of time before his departure, we stopped off at the Harvey House restaurant right inside the terminal for a farewell meal. We were sitting at the table when Rose casually mentioned to David that she used to work right here in the station before the war. Right about then, one of the passing waitresses froze, her eyes going wide. "Rose, is that you? It's been so long." It turned out to be an old friend from her floor days. They stood there for a few minutes, laughing and catching up on the old days, before the waitress headed off to the kitchen and brought out our plates. It was a damn nice dinner. The food was excellent, and the atmosphere was a hell of a lot softer than the smoke-filled offices and back alley lounges we'd been frequenting all week. Rose leaned her chin on her hand, looking across the table at me with a playful glint in her eye. "Could you imagine me in one of those uniforms, dear?" I paused, shifting my gaze over to the pristine, starched black and white dresses the Harvey girls wore, complete with the prim white aprons and hairnets. I looked back at my wife, shook my head, and said flatly, "Not really." Rose let out a bright, beautiful laugh that cut right through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Once the dinner was done and the bill was paid, we walked David out to his designated platform so he could finally board. The massive diesel locomotive of the Santa Fe Super Chief idled heavily on the tracks, casting long, vibrating shadows across the concrete. "Next time, don't bring trouble," I joked, giving him a firm handshake. "Next time, you should come visit me," David replied, his grin splitting his face. "I might just do that," I said. "I was talking to Rose," he said, winking over my shoulder at her. "But if she decides to bring you along, I suppose that would be fine too." Rose and I stood side by side on the platform, arms linked, watching as the silver cars of the Super Chief slowly began to roll. The whistle blew, a lonely, echoing wail that bounced off the station walls as the train picked up speed. Heading eastbound out into the night toward Kansas City, the platform gradually cleared out until it was just the two of us left in the cool evening air. I reached out, wrapping my arm around her waist, and pulled Rose tight against my side. "Let's go home, dear," I said. When we got home, I sank into my favorite chair, poured myself a decent glass of whiskey, and lit a Camel. The second the match flared, Hammett made a leap from the rug and settled straight into my lap, demanding his dues. I started petting him, his heavy purring vibrating right against my hand. Down the hall, Rose got into the shower. Before long, the hot water was causing the bathroom to steam up, sending faint, warm ribbons of vapor out into the hallway. I reached over to the small radio sitting on the side table and clicked the knob. I waited a few seconds as the vacuum tubes warmed up, a soft amber glow bleeding out from behind the dial before the smooth sound of late-night music drifted into the room. I had just taken a sip of the rye when the music sharply cut out. A static-heavy news flash crackled across the speaker. The announcer's voice took on that urgent, dramatic cadence, detailing how the Los Angeles Police Department had just completely solved the high-profile murder case, bringing a swift and peaceful end to a dangerous manhunt. I just shook my head, a slow smile creeping onto my face, and chuckled into the empty room. Yeah, it was the police, all right.